The rain was pouring like from a bucket. Large drops hit the wet asphalt, creating small puddles that reflected the dim light of street lamps. Nighttime New York was restless. The sounds of sirens shouting pedestrians and the rustling of cars created a chaotic background, making it hard to hear one's own thoughts. Chuck Norris slowly walked down the sidewalk, hands in the pockets of his old, faded jacket. He wore worn-out jeans and boots that soaked up the water, making each step accompanied by an unpleasant squelch. His face was hidden under an old baseball cap, from which wet strands of gray hair peeked. He stopped by the door of a small hotel in the city center. The sign flickered with red light, the Grand Manhattan Hotel. The building looked old-fashioned, but expensive. Large glass doors, golden handles, and a red carpet at the entrance. Chuck sighed deeply and pushed the door open. Inside, there was silence, interrupted only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Soft light from the lamps highlighted the luxurious interior, marble floors, leather sofas in the lobby, large pots with live plants. Behind the reception desk stood a young man in an expensive suit and perfectly ironed tie. His name on the badge was Jason. Chuck approached the desk, took off his wet baseball cap, and placed it on the marble surface. Jason looked up and immediately pressed his lips together, giving Chuck a scrutinizing look. "Good evening. I need a room for the night," Chuck said calmly. Jason raised an eyebrow slightly, trying to hide a smile. "Sorry, but we don't have any rooms available," he replied coldly, not even glancing at the computer screen. Chuck raised his gaze, his eyes narrowing. "Really? Then why does the sign say rooms available?" Jason hesitated for a second, but quickly regained his composure. "That's a mistake. Everything is occupied." "I don't think the problem is with the rooms," Chuck said quietly, fixing his gaze on the young man. Jason looked Chuck over again. The wet jacket, worn-out jeans, and boots that left wet marks on the marble floor. "Our hotel has certain standards. Perhaps you should look for something more affordable." "You mean to say I don't look good enough for this place?" Chuck's voice turned cold. Jason nervously adjusted his tie. "We just have a specific clientele. I don't think you fit the profile." Silence hung in the air. Two men in expensive suits, sitting on a soft couch by the entrance, were watching the situation with interest. A woman in an evening dress by the bar smiled mockingly, casting a glance at Chuck. Chuck clenched his jaw. "All right, here's the deal. I pay up front, cash. Give me the room." Jason grimaced. "It's not about the money. We simply can't risk the hotel's reputation." "Risk?" Chuck leaned in closer, his eyes turning as cold as ice. "What if I tell you that your job is hanging by a thread right now?" Jason scoffed dismissively. "Oh, really? And who are you to threaten me?" Chuck smiled faintly at the corners of his lips. "You'll find out tomorrow morning." He turned and walked toward the exit. His wet boots left marks on the marble floor. Behind him, he heard Jason's muffled laughter and the disdainful comments of the guests. But Chuck knew this wasn't the end. The next morning, people would knock on the hotel's door, and Jason would turn pale. And then he'd realize who he had just offended. Chuck Norris stood at the threshold of the hotel, clutching his old coat. The cold autumn wind outside pushed him toward the door as he debated whether to enter. His face was lined with wrinkles, his expression stern but calm, with a characteristic stubbornness that left no room for doubt. He took a deep breath, stretched, and stepped inside. The hotel was small but spacious, with a floor that emitted a faint smell of wood and coffee. The windows along the front corridor were covered with heavy curtains, creating a dim light. Behind the counter stood a young man in a dark suit with a pale expression. "Good evening," Chuck said as he approached the counter. "I'm looking for a room for the night." The employee looked at him, but the gaze was one Chuck wasn't used to seeing in people, not respect, but rather assessment, as if he were someone who had no right to be there. "I'm sorry, but perhaps you should try another hotel," the employee replied without a smile, his voice stern. We have certain dress code requirements for our guests. Chuck raised an eyebrow, noticing how the employee assessed his attire, an old coat, worn-out shoes, jeans he'd had for years. But what could he say about that? He didn't need any explanations. I came from far away. I don't have time to look for another hotel, Chuck replied calmly, his expression unchanged. I just need a place to sleep. The employee, clearly unprepared for such a conversation, turned his gaze away, trying to find a reason to refuse him. We have rules, sir, he remarked, still not looking Chuck in the eye. It's our corporate policy. Chuck smiled, as if completely unaffected by the situation. He looked back at the man behind the counter. Rules, he repeated calmly. Systems designed to make consequences predictable. But you must understand one simple thing. I am not the problem. The problem is how you look at people. The employee looked at him, momentarily surprised. Chuck paused, his voice still calm, but with a certain firm determination. I came here with a simple desire to rest. Perhaps you should first look at me, not my clothes, he said. Look at me as I look at you. Do you see a person or just a person in the details? Let's try to be human. Meanwhile, another younger employee approached the counter, observing the situation with annoyance. Chuck noticed how she began to grow nervous as the situation dragged on. We can't accommodate you. Please leave the hotel, she said in a sharp tone. Chuck remained motionless, his gaze becoming even more piercing. You want me to leave? He asked, addressing her as if she were the main voice in this situation. At that moment, she realized the problem wasn't his clothing, but something deeper. The employee behind the counter suddenly slumped his shoulders, and it seemed he was intrigued by Chuck's idea. Sorry, but we're really not allowed to make exceptions, the female employee muttered. And if I come in looking like what you want to see, would that change the situation? How can clothes change you if we're all looking for the same thing, a place to find peace? Chuck asked, his voice calm as a river. The employee fell silent for a moment, her gaze softening, as if she was thinking for the first time about Chuck's words. Fine, she said slowly, nodding. You can stay for the night, but next time, we ask you to follow our dress code. Chuck smiled, slowly removing his coat. He knew this was only the first step in a change, a small victory, but it meant far more than just a night at this hotel. But here's what happened next. He found out that the hotel staff was tangled in their own rules, which served more for control than comfort. He was ready to change that. And this moment marked the beginning of a new conflict, one that would bring about change in time. Chuck sat at a small table in the corner, watching as new guests entered the hotel. His presence didn't go unnoticed by the staff, though now he had become just another part of the place. Calmly sipping his coffee, he felt the air around him growing heavier. Something was wrong. A few minutes later, one of the guards, a tall man with a stern expression, approached the front desk and spoke to the manager. Chuck overheard their conversation. This guy, Chuck Norris, we can't just leave him here. Do you know who he is? The guard asked. The manager glanced at him, sighing as if he was hesitant. Yeah, I know. He's not just some old man. He's passed through this area more than once. Everyone knows his name, but I can't turn him away. You saw what happened. The guard seemed uncertain about his actions. But we can't give him power here. He'll make us change the rules. Chuck heard their conversation and felt the tension mounting. All these conspiracies and secret talks only heightened the feeling that he was part of something bigger, something that seemed underground and hidden even from the hotel's own employees. When Chuck stood up, he headed toward the front desk. The manager, noticing him, quickly stood up, trying to hide his unease. I want to talk to you, Chuck said calmly, but with a hint of discomfort in his voice. Something's not right here. The manager nervously glanced at the guard. He understood that this wasn't just about whether Chuck could stay the night at the hotel. This was a war between control and freedom, between those who hold power and those who want to break the system. Chuck, I don't understand what you're talking about, the manager replied, trying to look innocent. You'll understand, Chuck paused. This isn't just about a place to stay. It's about who controls these places and why they're so afraid of change. The manager saw from Chuck's gaze that he had no choice anymore. He already knew that Chuck had figured out more than he should have. You're right, the manager said, his voice turning serious. This hotel isn't what it seems. We're all working under the control of one organization, and they don't like people like you. So, you'd better leave this place as soon as possible. Chuck looked at him with interest. And are you going to throw me out? The manager leaned toward him, lowering his voice as if he feared someone might overhear. No, I'm not going to throw you out. But if you stay, you'll be under surveillance, and you won't leave without consequences. You don't understand who you're dealing with. Chuck paused. He knew there was no room for compromise in such a situation. His intuition told him that he had entered a game where there would be no place for him if he allowed the other side to set the rules. I don't care who they are, Chuck replied firmly. I'll do what I have to do, even if it costs me more than I planned. At that very moment, the guard behind him took a step forward, seemingly ready to take action. But Chuck, anticipating this, quickly raised his hand, stopping him. If you want to start a game, I'm ready. But know this, I won't play by your rules. The manager and the guard exchanged glances. They saw that this man was not just an old traveler, but someone with vast experience, ready to face any challenge. The system of their hotel, their control, was on the verge of collapse. And now, Chuck had only one goal, to find out who was behind this hotel and why they were so determined to control all the guests. So, he didn't back down. His game was just beginning. Chuck felt the atmosphere around him growing even more tense. Every movement of the guard and every glance from the manager were like careful steps on ice that was about to crack. Chuck remained calm, but his eyes were no longer just observing. They were searching for weak spots in the defense. The manager took a step back and tried to smile, but the smile looked fake. You don't understand, Chuck, he said quietly. We're trying to protect you from yourself. Chuck smiled. I don't need your protection, especially not from something I don't even know. The guard, clearly losing patience, spoke up. This isn't a joke, old man. If you think you can handle this, you're deeply mistaken. Chuck raised his hand and threw him a look that left no doubt. This wasn't a threat, it was a challenge. You think I'm afraid? Go ahead, take one more step, and we'll see who's scaring who. The manager looked at the guard again, as if seeking confirmation on whether he could trust the situation. But the guard just shrugged. He knew this was the moment to act. They couldn't let Chuck stay. Get him out right now, the manager ordered. But in that instant, Chuck threw the situation off balance. Suddenly, he quickly grabbed a few papers from the desk and threw them on the floor. Each sheet flew like a meteor, scattering documents across the floor, creating a noise that echoed through the hotel lobby. You want to throw me out? Chuck loudly addressed the manager again. You forget why I'm here. All your secrets are right here, and you can't just destroy them. Everyone fell silent. The guard stepped closer, but Chuck didn't back down. He had already picked up one of papers that had fallen to the floor and showed it to the manager. You're telling me this is just a coincidence? His voice grew dull, heated with anger. This is all your organization, and you've been using me? The manager wasn't ready for this. He looked at the guard, his expression turning fearful. Now Chuck understood that he had found what he was looking for. All these documents were connected, and he could prove it. I'm no longer afraid of your threats. And you no longer have control, Chuck said, looking directly into the manager's eyes. Now you'll understand who's in charge of this place. The guard was already a step away from taking action, but Chuck hated every moment of this challenge. He wasn't going to back down. This was just the first battle. You'd better explain to me who's really behind this place. Otherwise, this will end badly for you. Everyone present could feel the situation becoming increasingly dangerous. This conflict was no longer something that could be controlled, It had gone beyond simple fear and had become a matter of survival for everyone involved in the dark dealings of this hotel. Chuck stood in the middle of the lobby, his gaze cold and determined. The manager was powerless, and the guard, though trying to remain calm, couldn't hide the nervous tension in his movements. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, whether it would be violence or a resolution that would change everything. Chuck took a step toward the window and looked out at the city stretching beyond the glass. Streetlights scattered their glow, but the night was dark and relentless. The only thoughts swirling in his mind were simple. This was his chance, his opportunity to change everything. The manager realized he could no longer hide the truth. He took a slow step forward, not even glancing at the guard who had yet to dare stop him. "You're right," he said quietly. "You really aren't afraid, and I can't hide what we've been doing anymore. But you don't understand. It's not just us anymore. It's the system, and now you've become part of it." Chuck turned to face him. "So what, you're saying I should keep quiet? Get involved in your dirty business?" The manager froze, sighed, and simply nodded. He no longer had the strength to fight the truth. But this moment was crucial for Chuck. He understood that he could no longer allow himself to be entangled in all of this. He needed to act, and act quickly. "Stay in your world, but I know your names now and what you do. And trust me, it's all going to come to light soon." Chuck clenched his fists and, without waiting for any further reaction, walked toward the exit. His steps echoed loudly in the empty lobby, and there was no trace of fear left in him. All these years he had endured, watched, but now everything was changing. This moment marked the last time he would remain silent. Stepping out into the street, he felt the cold wind brush against his face. In this world, there were many dark corners and secrets, but now he had the power. And while he knew the battle was only beginning, this step was the first on his path to exposing all the secrets and breaking the system he now truly understood. He stood there on the street amidst the city's quiet, with a newfound sense of freedom and confidence. Now he knew that, despite everything, he was ready to face any consequences. And for him, this was only the beginning. Chuck stood on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the night air, feeling how each inhalation was heavy and important. He realized that a tough road lay ahead of him, but today he had taken the first step toward change. Watching the dim streetlights and the misty silhouettes of the surrounding buildings, Chuck felt an extraordinary determination. The night, which had once been empty and foggy, now seemed full of meaning. He pressed the phone screen to call his lawyer. Tomorrow he would meet with a few people who, he knew, could help expose everything that had happened in this hotel. But it wasn't just that. Chuck understood that fighting the system wasn't just about exposing it. It was about building a new reality, one where everyone was valued, where no one was demeaned because of their clothing or background. The next morning, the hotel was a completely different place. Chuck had left a few instructions and made some calls, and it turned out that the hotel was already awaiting inspection by the authorities. The bad practices would not go unnoticed, and new standards would be set, ones that would truly help everyone working there. As Chuck left the building, he glanced back at the old hotel doors. While they still seemed like part of the old system, he knew that real changes had already occurred. His calm determination had become the stone that changed the course of the river, even if this change was only the beginning. And when he returned home, there was lightness in his heart. All these years, he had been a participant and an observer. Now, thanks to his calm but firm step, he had made the world a little better. And even though the story didn't end the way he had expected, Chuck understood one thing. Change starts with us, and even the smallest step in the right direction can be the beginning of a great transformation.